Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm coming to you tonight from my home, which is considerably more comfortable than my office where I usually am at for these. I've just come back from Atlanta and literally just arrived back in my house about 35, 40 minutes ago. And so rather than try to go down to Chatham and do this, my wife was gracious enough to give me the upstairs, and so I'm sitting in my easy chair, and I typically go to sleep about this time. So if Bob can't keep me going, or if we don't dialogue quite well, if I start snoring, you'll have a peek into my family room and my family life. But tonight we're going to talk about the middle portion of the Atlanta campaign. From my perspective, certainly some of the most intriguing and interesting aspects of the campaign. Of course, just those of you who maybe were listening to some of Bob's comments, he was talking about Gettysburg and so forth. The reality of the matter is that Atlanta is extraordinarily complex, and it's a campaign that really is so decisive in the Civil War. And yet, for all that work, it's a Western campaign, and it doesn't involve Lee, and it doesn't involve Grant. And so, consequently, what we find is I think that Atlanta has been generally overlooked for a long time. There's a lot of small works there, but not a lot of detailed works, unfortunately. Some people have done a lot of work on it, and others just do a kind of a quick pass through, and you might get 200, 300, 400 pages, and then they move on to something else. Whereas certainly is what Bob is doing for us, which is Atlanta on the weekends. It was our intention to do the Atlanta campaign over 8 tours in 4 years, and then circumstances were such with COVID and everything that we started bundling up a couple of these. So we did 1 and 2 as our first tours back, and had a very good time. Everything went well. We went to the top of the mountain, and we saw a lot of different things there. It was a fabulously fascinating event as we took in Dalton and the areas around there, and Resaca, and then we're going to do four full days in the field, divided between 2 programs. You can go to one or the other or both if you wish, but we're going to basically run over about 5 days actually that we'll cover it. Start on Wednesday night, do Thursday, Friday, then a Friday night, and then Saturday and Sunday. And this middle portion we're going to do is got to take us all the way from Adairsville all the way through Kennesaw. And there's a lot of activity there. There's 7, 8 different encounters and battles and so forth that are all pretty fascinating, but they are part of the grander scheme of things as we're going to look at. And so with that, this will go, I think, incredibly fast because we really can't deep dive into a lot of this. We're going to basically move like the armies do and move relatively quickly to get down to the Chattahoochee River line by the end of the day here. And so that's going to be our mission tonight. Now, something I did want to seriously advocate, because we've all been tied up by COVID. In fact, COVID is affecting us again right now. We postponed a program with Dennis Fry last weekend because of some vulnerabilities in his household that didn't make it workable for him to come out with us. And then my premiere program next week on Grierson's Raid was about 15 people. We're going to come on that, and the recent COVID restrictions and breaks and this other stuff have chased literally half of them away. So what was 15 people is now 7 people next week, although we're doing Jim Ogden the week after that doing the Tullahoma campaign, and we're going to have about 17 people on that and have had no attrition there. But then one more, I had an attrition on our Winchester program, and Neil Mangum and I are going to reschedule the Central Plains program, not because of the people, but because the places we wanted to go, there are 7 places on our tour that are closed because of COVID, and a couple others are limiting access and so forth, and so we just can't get access. So this COVID thing is constantly affecting us. We did put out updated guidance on our website at www.blueandgrayeducation.com. Look at that on there. But the long and short of that is, and I expect this to change again as we get a little more data, but the long and short of it is that our medical advisory team has said, no, the breakthroughs and stuff, we're going to wear masks on our vehicles until we get a better look-see at this. That's primarily, and I'll just quote Gary Wilson, who's our infectious diseases guy, who's vice president of our board. He said, Len, the biggest thing we don't know right now, he says, is we're not trying to be picky. He says, what we don't know is there was rumor when the vaccine first came out that it might be effective as short as 6 months. And he said, the other thing we don't know is we don't have enough anecdotal evidence as to what is the results of the D variant. In other words, we saw in the first part of COVID, we saw thousands and thousands of people dying. We're not seeing that right now. What we're seeing is that we're seeing thousands and thousands of cases, and we're seeing breakthroughs, but we don't know what's happening to the people who were vaccinated who get this. Are they just getting a little snivel and getting better after a few days and maybe getting a bit more immunity? Or are we likely to see people who maybe have comorbidities who are now vulnerable, which is why Dennis had to back out. Dennis Fry backed out because his wife has serious comorbidities, and he was concerned about the possibility of a breakthrough, even though they were there. We just don't know what's happening to people who are immunized who get this and have comorbidities. So hopefully we'll have enough anecdotal evidence in the next month or two that we can perhaps look at loosening up again. But for those of you who travel with us and stuff, I just need you to understand that this is a moving target. We're doing the best we can with it, but the insurance people are pretty demanding, as Bob knows, in the legal business, and they basically said, we'll cover you as long as you are paying due diligence to the federal guidance and state and local guidance. It said if you do that and you've done the things you're supposed to do, like wear masks, and somebody gets sick, then the insurance company will cover us. If we flaunt it and we get sued, we get problems. So that's really where the board of directors is. That's where we are on that right now. Last thing I'd like to offer before we get started was that Karen, who is our host here, puts a lot of alerts out there. She is Miss National Archives in NARA. She's been working there 20 years doing research and stuff, and they are very, very, very slow in reopening. Now, if you guys go and look at the chat portion of this feature, she has sent you all the latest NARA strategic plan. And what's important about this, it's important to Bob Jenkins, it's important to me, and it should be important to anybody who is interested in accessibility of researching American history. Right now, the National Archives are really not available to researchers and to historians and everybody else. And if the government could work their way, they would probably keep it that way because they can cut their costs down and everything else. Right now, people have a very hard time getting in to NARA to do any research at all. Karen, who they know by all means Jenkins has been going there for years and years and years. She has to apply for appointments. She just got a 4-hour appointment tomorrow. And after that, she's got to be gone. So serious research is not being done. So the recommendation is take a look-see at the plan that Karen has made available to you. And more than anything else, if you are so inspired and stuff, get a hold of your congressman and or your senator's office and tell them, open up the National Archives, make it fully accessible to researchers and to historians again, because it hasn't been since COVID, and they're very, very reluctant to reopen. Indeed, they were supposed to reopen. Everybody was supposed to be back on the 2nd of August. The union required 30 days notice. They've gotten no notice at all. The workers are not back at the National Archives, even though the government was going to put them back in there to do that. So that's the game plan, guys and gals. If you're interested in this, if you support good history, this is something you guys can do: is get on the phone, get a hold of your congressman, get a hold of your senators, and say, hey, full access to the Library of Congress and National Archives sooner rather than later, because without it, you're going to be crippling people who are trying to do good research. And as Forrest Gump would say, and that's all I'm going to say about that. So having said that, great. Thanks so much. And let's go ahead and get started then. Good evening, Bob. It's good to have you back. Gosh, it just seems like just not so terribly long ago that you and I were having one of the first talks in this series, and now we're 6-7 months into it, and it's the 25th lecture and or talk, and now we're talking about the November programs, which I'm certainly looking forward to us doing.
Well, thank you, Lynn. Thank you for having me again, and everybody, thank you for coming out, tuning in tonight to hear a little something about Atlanta and what I call the Georgia campaign, because it encompassed the entire state of Georgia from the spring of winter and spring of 1864 all the way through Christmas at the capture of Savannah. But this section, tours 3 and 4, as Lynn has pointed out, we're going to try to cover the ground following Resaca, May 15 and 16 at Resaca. And so we're going to leave Calhoun and the banks at Resaca of the Oostenaula River and find our way south to Adairsville, and then and so forth further south through Cassville and all the way down eventually to Atlanta. But tour 3, which would be Thursday and Friday, I believe, is it the 4th and 5th of November, Lynn? We're going to focus on, we'll spend the morning looking at some of the ground around Cassville and the Cassville affair, and talk about what didn't happen there. And then we're going to go down in the afternoon and look at the beginning of what's called the Hell Hole by many of the soldiers, and New Hope Church, and what did happen there. And then Friday we'll get to Pickett's Mill and the Battle of Dallas, and 3 very lopsided battles we'll be covering. Over the weekend, though, we'll get into Kennesaw Mountain and Culp Farm, and there's some other little fun stops in between, like Gilgal Church, for example, and the Latimer House. We'll talk about some of these stuff. Lost Mountain, Pine Mountain, and all of these other little places. And if everybody's game and want to stay out late one evening, maybe even find their way to Allatoona Pass and see what that's all about. So
good looking program. One more point I'd like to make before we actually start talking back and forth, Bob. For those of you who are with us tonight, Bob and I are going to basically chat back and forth for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to questions and or comments from you guys at about 8:45. The way that you'll get access to that is that Karen will tell you all about 8:45 that you can unmute your buttons, and But to get in there, you need to raise your hand figuratively on the switch there, so I can see that you want to ask a question, and then I'll call on people basically in the order received. Ask your questions quickly, and that way we can get through as many as we need to, and then we'll finish up right about 9 o'clock. So that's the game plan for y'all to interface with us tonight. Bob, the first thing I wanted to talk about, I was so overawed at Dalton and Resaca and so forth. I think just the growth of the preservation effort out there that you have had a large measure of involvement in helping to make it happen. That I think that was so visually demanding and rewarding, that I think that perhaps some of what got lost in that was just the magnitude of this undertaking that Sherman has started with. And I have some thoughts. So I was wondering, we've never seen anything like this before, or hadn't seen anything like this before in American military history. The composition of an army group, not just a single army moving against another army, but a cluster of armies, the Ohio, the Tennessee, the Cumberland, all under one commander, all with very substantial commanders of their own. What do you think about that? What's your impression?
Absolutely, Lynn. Sherman didn't win the Atlanta campaign or the Georgia campaign on the morning of September 2nd as the 20th Corps strolled into the gates of Atlanta for the first time. He won it because back in following his Meridian expedition in middle of February, but basically the months of March and April, Sherman geared up and mobilized something we've never seen before, really modern warfare. Sherman's ability to be able to equip 100,000 men on a single track from Nashville and Louisville south, all the way down across the Tennessee River, across into Chattanooga, into the bottleneck, and down into Georgia, and then to repair and replace track and rails as he needed to continue to get the trains moving as close to his armies as they progressed further into Georgia, deeper into the state. That was really his brilliance, and so he may not have been. And some of the folks that took the tour with me in Dalton and Resaca, and I talk about chess play versus checker play, and maybe Sherman wasn't the tactician on the battlefield that others may have been, but what he was a master strategist, and that really was his brilliance. Keeping the thing moving forward, keeping his momentum, keeping pressure on Johnston, and keeping his army supplied. So those were the two maxims that he was that really led his decision making. Sometimes he made mistakes. He chose the wrong tactical decision, but he quickly recovered, such as at Resaca, such as at Kennesaw, and pressed on with his momentum, pressed on with his numeric advantage, such that he would not give up the strategic offensive. So,
well, the thing that strikes me about this is that what is a gift and an organizational first for the United States armies is also has its own limiting factors. And the other thing that I've thought that perhaps has not gotten full appreciation of the Atlanta campaign is really the primacy of the Western and Atlantic Railroad, and both for its obvious contributions to both armies. I mean, it provides a source of supplies and communications out of Atlanta up to Johnston's army, but it also becomes the most expeditious vehicle for bringing reinforcements and or troops and food and so forth to the armies that are operating. And I think that probably when you look at that and you look at Sherman with his span of command with three armies, I think these armies, because of the Western and Atlantic, don't swing too far afield. They don't go too far west or too far east, because ultimately any army that is out marching out on its own has either got to bring the provender into it, it's got to scavenge it, or it's got to stay close enough to its source of supplies so it can't operate way out in Alabama and elsewhere because of this.
Absolutely. And if you think about it, this is the deepest into the heart of the Confederacy that the Federals reach, at least at this on this scale, and all of that is not tied to a river or a port. If you think about all of the other strategic moves of the Federal forces up to this point, primarily Nashville, the Cumberland River, Memphis, Vicksburg, Mississippi River, New Orleans, of course, all the coastal cities across the South. But this is, I mean, it took the Federals the entire war. Well, Lee had something to do with it, to get 50 miles from the other side of the Rappahannock River to Richmond. You know, so without good railroads, they were having to zig and zag. But the point that I'm making is that without the Western and Atlantic Railroad, there would be no Atlanta campaign. You could call it the Western and Atlantic Railroad campaign if you wanted. Sherman had to have 10 trains a day to supply his army. Roughly, imagine 10 boxcars of 10 trains laden with food and materials and fodder for the horses and ammunition and clothing and whatever needed to follow an army. So that's 1,000 men per boxcar per day of hardtack and coffee. In contrast, Johnston had to have 6 trains a day to feed his army. So do the math. Maybe he had about 60,000 men. Now in Dalton, he had less to start with. And well, we can play the numbers game a little bit about what he actually had. But the point is, Johnston needed the train to supply him from Atlanta north, and Sherman needed the train to supply him from Chattanooga and Cleveland, Tennessee, south. And in the further and the deeper into Georgia Sherman went, the more obviously Sherman had to then repair and replace track and place garrisons at places like the Oostenaula River Bridge at Resaca, eventually the Allatoona Pass. We'll get there in this this phase. But Sherman was tied to that railroad, and how long could he survive away from it? Well, we have a pretty good test with this particular series when he decides to cut west and get to New Hope and try to flank Johnston. I'm getting ahead of myself from tonight, but it lasts about 10 days out in the wilderness of western, west of Marietta. So.
Well, you know, the other thing, and I want to make this one other point before we move deeper into the campaign and start maneuvering with Sherman, and that is that the significance of the Atlanta campaign. You know, people always tend to get lost in sometimes in a macro picture, and they don't understand the very real implications of the commencement of this campaign. For most of the war, the Confederacy is still very, very constricted by their own lines of communication within the South. And once the Federal Army got to Corinth, Mississippi, once they started moving along the Mobile and Ohio Railroad and the Charleston and Memphis railroads, once those got cut, you saw what Lee had to do when he sends Longstreet west for Chickamauga. Longstreet has to go through South Carolina, Augusta, Atlanta, and on up. When the Memphis and Charleston is cut in 62, Braxton Bragg moves to Kentucky by going from Tupelo to Mobile, across Mobile Bay, up to Montgomery, over to Atlanta, up to Chattanooga, and then they get off the train and they start to maneuver. That's all gone now.
You know,
the South
Atlanta
doesn't have that anymore.
Yeah, geography doesn't work for the South very well, at least in the Western theater, because everything opens up and invites invasion, invites, Tennessee and Kentucky open up with the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers and valleys. But for example, today, when I'm leaving Dalton, Georgia, and trying to go, say, to Memphis, there's no good east-west route with Lookout Mountain Range and other geographic features between here and there in the Tennessee River. I have to go to Nashville, take the loop around, and get down. So the point is, geography certainly didn't help. And when that rail line was cut that you're describing, the Memphis and it absolutely made the Eastern and Western theater had to go three sides around the box.
Okay, going into the ramifications of Resaca and crossing the Oostenaula River. What's Joe Johnston? Where does he find a new anchor point? What's Johnson thinking when he loses the bastion that was Rocky Face Ridge and so forth?
Yeah. Well, we first, and I'm going to back up a tad to tie that in. We first have to understand Johnston's mindset. And, in the law, when we look at something, we believe people to tell the truth unless that testimony is refuted by conflicting evidence. So in Johnston's narrative of military operations, his post-war apology, 1868, and in his Vineville, which is near Macon, Georgia, report that he writes on October 2nd, I believe, 1864, about the campaign. So that's almost contemporaneous with the campaign. And then we have this 3 years after the war apology. Both of those say, I did not believe Dalton was defensible, for my left flank was open. In other words, in the air, meaning that Sherman could tie me down in my face at Dalton and then send a flanking march around me, which is exactly what happened. But Johnston thought they were going to go for Rome, that Sherman was going for Rome with the McPherson's Army of the Tennessee and get in behind him at Kingston, which is a little further south, and on the Western Atlantic Railroad, and cut him. So that Johnston wanted to fall back below the Oostenaula River line. And he said that in both of those. So we believe, and it's very clear, Johnston had no real offensive mindset for the first phase or the Dalton from a strategic or even a tactical standpoint. But when he, so in his mind, yes, he was surprised with the Snake Creek Gap and Resaca, but in his mind, it made no difference which place out of the West Sherman's going to pop out. He had to fall back below it anyway. That's been somewhat of a cover-up, I guess, to say by I don't think that historians have really delved deep enough into this whole Snake Creek Gap, but that was chapters 1 and 2. Let's get to 3 and 4. Johnston is acting, and Sherman writes a week into this campaign to Halleck. He's sending emails up to Washington, D.C. every night and up to the wee hours of the morning, and he's sending, electronic, everybody telegraph line is electronic mail. They had electronic mail or emails back then. Sherman is sending telegraphs every night telling Halleck everything and gets to Grant. And Sherman is saying Johnston acts totally on the defensive. And he's right. And so Johnston's going to poke a counterstrike here or there, but in reality, he's reacting on the defensive, mainly because that's Johnston's nature, but also because Sherman is pressing on and pressing the advantage. Sherman's orders from when he and Grant met to begin the campaign, and Grant went east to piggyback with the Army of the Potomac and Meade and so forth. Sherman's instructions were to go after Johnston, tie him down, bear hug him. In other words, get a grip on him and don't let go. And then the rest of the order, the point was Grant did not want Johnston to be able to detach and move some of his force up to reinforce Lee so that Lee could reverse fortunes in Virginia. They didn't want a reverse of what happened at Chickamauga when Longstreet's Corps came down in the fall of '63. They didn't want that to happen. And so this was the first time in the war where you have a complete concerted action. Grant's, and there are other theaters too, but the main two are Grant with Meade, the Army of the Potomac in Virginia, and then out here with the three armies that Sherman's going to have in his army group going after Johnston. His orders, his instructions are to go after Johnston, at Johnston's army, break it up if you can, and to drive deep into the interior of Georgia, inflicting all the damage that you can. Now later it becomes the Atlanta campaign because that becomes the centerpiece. The reason Atlanta is the centerpiece is it's the hub of the Western Atlantic Railroad. It was the place from which Johnston had to fall back toward to maintain his line of communication and supply, and it was the line running down the Western Atlantic by which Sherman had to maintain his back to keep him supplied, as we've already talked about. So Johnston reacts to Sherman. Now, Johnston did have a couple of little toys in his playbook or in his bag of tricks. One of them was he planned a little thing at Adairsville, that first slide. Karen, if you'll back up one, the first slide is the Adairsville affair, but a battle did not happen there, although some of Howard's 4th Corps, including the Arthur MacArthur's 24th Wisconsin guys, and let's see, I think the 44th Illinois was the other regiment, got bloodied a little bit, had a couple of hundred men casualties to Cheatham's division who were defending. What the plan was at Adairsville, Johnston had in mind, he had sent his engineers down there to dig a line of earthworks across the low valley just north of Adairsville. There was a plain, and then there were ridges on both sides. It's about a 2-mile wide and a funnel about 6 miles deep. And that yellow, so you see the yellow area, that's what the National Park Service has deemed as the quote core battleground or battlefield area of the Adairsville. And then the red area is where they actually were firing bullets at each other. But the scale there is about 2 miles wide by 6 miles deep, thereabouts. The problem that Johnston found when he got down there, after he evacuated Resaca and had a rear guard action at Rome Crossroads or Calhoun, falling back from there on the 16th, the night of the 16th, throughout the 17th, and then here we are on the 18th at Adairsville. Johnston realized that those two plains, the high ground on either side, were really not blocking anything. There were plenty of roads by which Sherman could continue to flank him. So in the words of Tom Cruise in the It's No Good, in the movie Top Gun, it's no good, it's no good, I've got to withdraw, fight another day. So Johnston falls back, and in fairness, it really was not a very defensible place. We get to the Cassville area, and the Cassville affair, Johnston did have a pretty good game plan here to try to surprise Sherman. And what he had planned to do was he sent his one of his large corps and all of the baggage train to the west, directly south from Adairsville, down toward Kingston, and then to the right. And he would hope that most of Sherman's army would follow that, because that would kick up the most dust with all the wagons. The ploy worked, and in fact, more of 4 out of Sherman's 6 corps were further to the west, leaving only the 20th Corps and the 23rd Corps, Army of the Ohio, coming down the lesser route, which was the wagon roads directly south from Adairsville and down to Cassville. On that route, Johnston laid out a trap where he had the Corps of Polk, Army of Mississippi, as the anvil at the bottom of a little spell over where there's a place called Two Run Creek or Two Mile Creek. And then Hood was supposed to come around to the right up the Spring Place Road and over, and then do a flanking attack and strike the Federals in flank. The problem that Johnston had was the Yankees weren't where they were supposed to be. Some of them got there faster, and some of them got further to the right. And for 140 years, there was a great mystery as to whether or not Hood said when he went out to the right up that road, which is now known as Shotgun. One of the links to that is called Shotgun Road. When he went up there, he discovered Federal cavalry on his right and rear, much to his surprise. Now, turns out some of McCook's cavalry had gotten in around and advanced farther to the south and east than the Confederates had anticipated. That totally deranged the plan. Hood, instead of deploying to the west to attack the flank of the 23rd Corps as they came funneling down through this valley, and then potentially the 20th Corps could have gotten bottled up in this thing if the whole scheme had worked. Instead of that, though, Hood has turned around two of his divisions and is chasing or having to protect and defend this other thing. Hood said he had to fall back, and Johnston didn't really want to believe him, but had to believe him and said, well, if and he trusted Hood at this point in the campaign a lot, and certainly trusted him to be the offensive mechanism for whatever offenses he was looking to do. Most of these times, all of these times were Sacca, Culp Farm here, Pickett's Mill. There's four where Hood was always the one that was put in the position to make the attack at Hood's suggestion often. But I'm getting way ahead of myself, Lynn. But the point is, Cassville begins some of the rift between Hood and Johnston, and the beginning of the fraying of trust. Hood says, I can't make the attack. There were Federal cavalry to my right. Johnston is so sure he's got a winner here. He sends out he's actually sent a general order out to all the men. Men, you have braved 3 years of war and all of this, and you faced the enemy, and we've had to fall back for various reasons, but now we're going to turn and face the enemy. And I bid you, we're going to do it. We're going to do the thing here. And obviously it doesn't happen because Hood has to fall back. Johnston is surprised and then dismayed, and then follows up. There's a second surprise, and that is they fall back just below the village of Cassville on high ground, which looks good to Johnston. But that evening, Polk and Hood start looking at the enfilade fire that they're receiving from some of the Federals that have gotten in on the other side of the village, and said that this is no good. We can't hold this position. And by this time, Hardee comes in and forms to the left. And essentially, Johnston later says, I was talked out of staying at what I thought was the best defensible position in the entire campaign at Cassville. Well, if you bug out from Cassville, you got to go another 20 miles till you get to the Etowah River. The Etowah River is the next good defensive line, and just south of that, you start getting into the very bottom of the southern Appalachians at what's called the Allatoona Mountains and Allatoona Pass. And us Georgians call it Altoona because Allatoona, that's too many syllables, to get out sometimes. But anyway, Altoona or Allatoona Mountains. That's a Castell slide, Albert Castell's Decision in the West book. This comes out of Jim Miles' tour guide book. It just shows you the basic movements and what Johnston had in store. He had planned to gang up on Schofield with Polk and Hood. So
the phrase hellhole is intriguing. And why the hellhole? Why this? I know the triumvirate. We're talking New Hope, Tersch, Dallas, and so forth. How does the hellhole come to acquire its name?
Yeah, if you've ever spent a week in the Georgia Kudzu in about this time of year in July or August, well, even May, like they did, and go this one, that's the Etowah River. That's Federal earthworks on the north bank. And you're looking down at the Allatoona mountain range there. That's just near Cartersville today. So Sherman called that the Rubicon of Georgia, by the way, the Etowah River. So if you think about, Johnston had three rivers that he could play with. He had the Oostenaula River, that's Resaca to Rome. He has this one, the Etowah River, and then he's going to have the Chattahoochee River as three natural lines of defense. Think about what Lee did in Virginia in the Rapidan and the Rappahannock for 3 years, 4 years, and what happened here in 20, 30 days, 40 days. Those are both Barnard photos. This is a George Barnard, B-A-R, not Barnyard, but Barnard photo of Allatoona Pass. That shows you just how steep it was. Sherman would write in his memoirs, and he actually wrote contemporaneous at the time too, in letters to his brother and to his wife and to Halleck, that Allatoona was simply too big of a mountain to try to assault. Tell that to General French and General Sears, a couple of New Jerseyans that are going to try it on behalf of Mississippi in October 5th, 1864, Allatoona Pass. Hold the fort for I am coming. Y'all think that's a John Western line, right? No, it actually comes from Sherman from the Allatoona Pass, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Sherman realized that that was no mountain to try to attack. He's going to attack one a little later that maybe is a mistake. This one, he's not going to make that mistake. And to get to Lynn's question, he's going to choose to bypass the Allatoona mountain range and Etowah River to get down to this hellhole area.
Bob, let me interrupt. For those of you all who are looking at that, I want you to, this picture is a great picture, and it really describes a lot to you about what you need to understand about logistics and supplies. Look at all that lumber on the side and stuff, and look at what the base of the railroads and stuff are. They know here at Allatoona Pass and all along there that the maintenance of this railroad is absolutely the most important thing that is essential to support these armies, and they can't stand for a minute not to be able to get and have immediately available to themselves the supplies that are necessary to recharge and restore this railroad. They can't stand it not to have it. And it's not an accident you see all of those logs all sitting on either side of the railroad.
You're exactly right, Lynn. Those are all rail ties ready for repairing and moving on down the line to repair the next thing. Absolutely right. Yeah, so you see the three arrows of Schofield, Thomas, and McPherson. And essentially, Sherman decides instead of going southeast along the rail line, he's going to try to load up as much supply with his wagons with food and strike through this jungle of this part of Georgia, which is West Cobb and East Paulding counties in Georgia, by the way, and near Ackworth, just west of Ackworth. And so he's going to be striking out to the west in the hopes that he can sneak up and get to Marietta in Johnston's back door and cut him off there before Johnston realizes what's happened. And Johnston's still up there at the Etowah River or maybe Allatoona Mountain Pass there. And but much to his surprise, he takes off on the 23rd of May. And on the afternoon of the 25th of May, Thomas's Army of the Cumberland, particularly Geary's division, John White or White Star Geary, White Division, a White Star Division, 2nd Division of the Army of the Cumberland's 20th Corps under Hooker. They're going to come out of the woods after leaving Burnt Hickory and crossing over Pumpkin Vine Creek and some fun places like that. And they're going to come out of there just west of a place, a crossroads, where 5 roads meet at a little juncture where there's a little church called New Hope. And what do they find when they get there but the 14th Louisiana Austin, Major Austin's 14th Louisiana Battalion on skirmish line meeting them along with the rest of Stewart's division of Hood's Corps at New Hope Church, May 25th. That's going to be a nasty day for them. I want to tell this little fun thing before I get into the nasty of the hellhole. A lot of diaries, a lot of letters and diaries we read from these federal soldiers. I have some good fun with this. So my wife is a Hoosier, by the way, an Indiana girl, so I can kind of have fun with this. But they talk about, when they get to Dalton and Ringgold and Resaca, and they talk about how homely the North Georgia girls are. Well, the tobacco chewing ladies of Northwest Georgia, well, they ain't seen nothing until they get to this area of West Cobb, and some of the letters and diarists that talk about just how homely some of these folks are and how hard scrabble these are not large plantations. These are really a wilderness of 40 acres and a mule hard scrabble farmers in this part of the country, in that part of the country. And they are really shocked at just how backward what they see. So a lot of these federal soldiers. So I'm having a little fun about picking on my own Georgians, but anyway, they really talk about how crude and backward some of that country is or was. Anyway, so they have the attack on May 25th. Karen, if you want to hit the next slide, we'll see a painting of those are some of Georgia, Stovall's Georgia Brigade of Stewart's division, literally fighting in the New Hope Cemetery. They didn't, because of the fact that it was their part of the line was in the cemetery, they chose not to dig in, but instead tried to take cover behind the markers and monuments best they could that were there. But the Federals came literally right up the lane past that wooded line. Gary's division deploys and pushes back the skirmish line, Major Austin and another support regiment of one of Stovall's Georgia regiments. And when they get in the zone, Sherman's not far behind. He's telling Hooker to press. Their game plan was to get to Dallas. And if they could get through this New Hope 5 points here, there was a straight road from there leading down toward Dallas. So they thought there was another back road as well that they're trying to explore. McPherson's Army of the Tennessee is going further to the west and south, and they're going to get to Dallas. But they're not going to be linked for several days. There's going to be a gap of several miles, and that's going to be problematic for the Federals during this time. But anyway, Sherman's pressing, and so Hooker's pressing, and turns out it's going to be Williams' division that makes leads this attack, and they get chewed up, particularly Robinson's brigade, 123rd New York among them, and they're going to lose about 800 men in a couple of hours of fighting that afternoon, from late afternoon, mid to late afternoon. Ward, or at the time, Dan Butterfield's division is going to lose about 416, I think, and then another 385 is going to be out of Gary's division. So the Federals lose in about 3 hours of fighting about 1,600 men, virtually all of which are in the 20 Corps. Howard and the 4th Corps are going to be asked to come and support, but they're not going to get there in time. They've got too far to come, and by the time they get there, it's a terrible thundering storm that evening. So it's a lightning and thunder and hard rain, one of these vicious summer storms that we see in this part of the country. Stewart's division, by the way, Johnston, who was behind Stewart's division here, sends a courier a time or two up to Stewart and says, I've got some of French's division, I've got Quarles' brigade behind you, I've got this brigade, I've got so and forth, I can give you support. And Stewart writes back or sends a note back and says, my men will hold the line. My men have this covered. I mean, he was firm and he knew it was a one-sided affair. Stewart's losses, by the way, were only about 350 men and to 1,600 in that afternoon. That's a Rick Reeves painting, a famous painting of Hiram Granberry's Texas Brigade, Claiborne's division. You see the blue flag with the white moon in the middle, circle in the middle. That's Pickett's Mill. That's the Battle of Pickett's Mill. So what Sherman's going to do is, after following the New Hope fight of May 25th, he starts trying to slide. He realizes first he doesn't believe Johnston's in force. He still doesn't even really believe that, even after the May 25th New Hope debacle. So throughout the 26th, he's trying to figure out how he can probe and how he can advance, and he's pushing and trying to, but they're tangled up in a briar patch, in the middle of the Georgia jungle. And so he starts sliding Howard and orders him to send forces further to the east to get around the Confederate flank and try to strike the Confederates in their right flank. What happens is the Confederates are up on higher ground in the woods, and the Federals are on lower ground in the woods. The Confederates can see the Federals as they keep sliding to the east and the dust that's following their movements, but the Federals don't see the Confederates. And so every time they go a half a mile or a mile to the east and they try to, peek out of the woods, the Confederates are there entrenching. So they go another half mile, another mile. Finally, they get to this Pickett's Mill area, and the day's getting late, and they decide they better make an attack because Sherman's going to chew them up if they don't. So Howard sends a note, and the lot falls to Hazen's brigade, unfortunately for him and his men, and they're the first one, and essentially they get piecemealed. Wood's division, Thomas Wood's division, sends in a brigade at a time, and 3 of his brigades and 1 other, Scribner's brigade, I believe, out of the 14th Corps, Johnson's division, in support, are going to get chewed up piecemeal. And that's another one-sided affair. This time they're going up against Claiborne's division with a few supports from a couple other units. Again, they lose about 1,600 men, and Claiborne loses about 600. So almost a pretty lopsided number. Some Confederate cavalry are participating in this, by the way, in this action on the far. So they were close to the Confederate flank, but they didn't quite make it. So you think that 2 times Sherman would realize these were not successful adventures. You think that one side or the other would learn on this, but unfortunately for the Confederates, Johnston now believes that it's his turn to try one of these. On May 20, that was May 27. So May 25 was New Hope. May 27 is Pickett's Mill. Now May 28, back down below New Hope, about 4 miles as the crow flies, down to Dallas, Georgia, past Ellsbury Mountain, and on the far left of the Confederate line, where Bates' division is located, and some of Red Jackson's cavalry, which has come over from Mississippi and Alabama, are on the left. Armstrong and Ross's brigades, particularly. They're ordered to make essentially a demonstration in force, because Johnston now believes that Sherman is withdrawing from the area, and he wants to test that flank, thinking that they're no longer at Dallas, and wants to see if they're there. Johnston's almost right about this. Sherman is trying to slide McPherson's Army of the Tennessee to the northeast to connect with the rest of the Federals, because I mentioned there was a gap. That gap is going to hold true all the way from May 25 to the evening of May 31. They're not really connected, and Sherman knows it's problematic that he's got his army of the Tennessee 15th and 16th Corps guys are sitting out there on an island at Dallas. Problem for Johnston is that jungle that's protecting him is also protecting Sherman, and so Johnston doesn't see a good, easy way to break through that and crush this one wing. But he does try this demonstration, and Bate makes a mess of it. We can get into the details of that another day. But that's the Battle of Dallas. So it's the same thing happens in reverse. The Confederates attempt this attack, and if you go on Wikipedia, it'll say that the Federals lost 2,400 and the Confederates lost 3,000, which is nonsense. Logan actually in his report, it was almost an entirely 15th Corps fight, says he lost 379 men, and the Confederates lost about 1,200. Those are pretty good numbers. 300 to 500 Federal losses, 1,200 to 1,400 Confederate. That gets us the 2 or 3 and the hellhole. How it was called the hellhole was because this is the first time they're stuck in this jungle. They've got earthworks, there's rain, there's mud. They're like World War I fighting now. They're not kung fu fighting. They're World War I style fighting, where if somebody sticks their head up, they're liable to get a bullet through their head from a sharpshooter or somebody up in a tree that's looking down to see who moves. Um, the So you're for a week, you're going to be sitting, down in the muck here in a 4-foot trench with 2 feet of dirt above you and a headboard, a headlog, and there's nowhere to go to the bathroom. There's nowhere to eat safely. There's no way to sleep very well. So fatigue has become a real factor, and so neither side's liking this very much. And this is the hellhole. These 3 battles were the big deals, but there was skirmish fighting and little peekaboo, I dare you fights going on all the time between this brigade and that brigade, or this regiment and that detachment trying to take the other guy's skirmish line. So that's going on every day. And we're losing a few hundred every day to stuff like that. Featherston's brigade, for example, loses 100 men and another 100 men out of Adams and Scott on the evening of May 31st. As they see some of these sliding maneuvers by the Army of the Tennessee and the Army of the Cumberland trying to connect and then slide to the, I'm doing the wrong way for y'all on TV, sliding over to the east. And so they kind of go out there. They think the Federals are trying to make an advance on their line. So they go back to try to do something about it, and they get tangled up that evening. So it's a mess. It's a real mess until finally the 4th of June, Sherman kind of breaks out of it and gets his men farther to the east, and he's managed to get his cavalry moving again, and they attack Allatoona Pass from both sides, so the Confederates have to evacuate and give up Allatoona Pass and the mountains without a fight. So Sherman has effectively, even though the hellhole cost lives and cost a week and 10, 12 days of maneuvering, he managed to get Johnston out of the position of the Etowah River, the Rubicon of Georgia, as well as the Allatoona Mountains. Johnston has to fall back to the next line, which is going to be a line from the west, Lost Mountain, to the west is the Anchor, and all the way to the east is Brushy Mountain. It's called the Lost Mountain, Brushy Mountain line, and Pine Mountain line. Pine Mountain is this little high rise that's stuck out in the middle of that. That's going to be the next year. Now we're getting into June, June 4 to June 16, approximately.
Something I want to point out, and Bob just talked about this, and take a look at this for a second. Look at your vertebrae of the Western and Atlantic Railroad, the stitches and stuff. And when you look up around Cassville, you see the deployment of Johnson's troops. And then you look down to the hellhole that we just talked about, Pickett's Mill and New Hope Church, and you see the disposition again of the 3 Confederate corps, and you see the maneuvers of what Sherman is attempting to do. What the Confederates find absolutely essential is it doesn't really matter the condition of the Western and Atlantic Railroad, except for if you can get behind the other guy, because the railroad is a resource for both of them. And so you don't want to tear up the railroad that feeds you. But on the other hand, if you can get behind the enemy and you can get in his rear and you can get on the railroad, you have ended the campaign. And so as you look at Sherman's maneuvers here and how Johnson responds to him, Johnson is off the railroad, but he is between Sherman and the railroad. Absolutely. And after the fighting, after the fighting at the hellhole, what do these guys do? They don't drop back down to the Chattahoochee. They push back closer to the railroad, but still keep themselves between the railroad and Sherman's maneuvering armies. And so, with that, having gone to the Pine Mountain, Lost Mountain line in Kennesaw, let's go and let's talk about Sherman's miscalculation.
Dallas is off the map. It's about where the O in society. It got cut off, unfortunately. But the town of Dallas is a little south of the map, just below May 25, New Hope Church. Go ahead, Lynn. Yeah, let's move on to.
Go ahead and let's talk now about Sherman and his miscalculations at Kennesaw. And Hood's miscalculations at Kolb's farm.
Yeah, that's a watercolor. I think that's Blackjack Logan there, and the Army of the Tennessee, or his 15th Corps. And you see in the background a little bit of the rise of Kennesaw Mountain. Sherman has a lot of pressure going on, and so I'm gonna, if anybody has been on my tours, you'll know that I will throw guys under the bus, but I'll also give them their due when their due is, so I'll give some anti-Sherman stuff, but I'll give some pro-Sherman stuff, anti-Johnston or Hood and pro, so forth. Although I can't find much to dislike about General Thomas, by the way. I will give you that. He's my favorite Yankee. He's a Virginian. But anyway, I tried to be an equal opportunity employer. But let's get to Sherman and what pressures he's facing, as Lynn was directing here. Sherman starts this campaign with being the secondary thing. Grant and Meade and the Army of the Potomac and arresting Lee and destroying his army and the Confederate capital at Richmond is the main thing. At least it starts that way. All these others are support things. Well, once Grant gets bogged down in the trenches of Petersburg and can do no more maneuvering, and it's just a question of time before he can kind of starve the thing out, Sherman and all the other things, the Red River campaign, events in Louisiana and the Trans-Mississippi, events in other parts of the country, in the Shenandoah Valley, for example, things don't seem to be working very well for the Federals. And all over the North, people are reading in the newspapers these huge list of casualties, tens of thousands of casualties out of the wilderness in Spotsylvania and Cold Harbor and Petersburg, and will this war ever end? And there's momentum, and there is politics back in those days, just like there is today. We will not go there today about current politics. However, back in the day, there was some traction being gained by the Democratic Party, and their candidate for president in the 1864 election is going to be George McClellan, a very popular general who has made it his position that he will sue for peace and try to find a way. If he's elected, he will call on the Confederate government and say, hey friends, let's be friends again. Let's stop our fighting. You can have your slaves. We'll just go back, reset the button back like it was in 1860 and be one big happy family again. And if that doesn't work, then we can have two countries and try to trade together and be nice neighbors. That's what his campaign platform is. And Sherman is feeling the pressure. Grant and others Lincoln is feeling the pressure. Lincoln feels the pressure so much so that as well late into August, I think it's the 14th or 24th of August, he's writing a secret note that he has all of his cabinet. That's another story for another day. But he's having all of his cabinet members sign the back of this letter that he's folded up. And they don't even know what it says, but it basically says Lincoln says to his cabinet that if they lose in November, that before they have to turn over the reins in March, the following spring, back then it wasn't January, it was March, that they would do everything in their power from November to March to try to finish winning the war, because the election will have been won by the other party on grounds that would end the war in a way. Sherman feels that pressure, and he realizes that something's got to give. And with that in mind, he knows that he either has to flank again, and that means go west, young man, to flank around the Kennesaw Mountain line down to the back at Nickajack Creek and try to get over at the Campbellton Road and down to Turner's Ferry at Chattahoochee River. Or if he has stretched Johnston out 8 miles like he's stretched out about 8 or 10 miles. He figures Johnston's got to be stretched out 6 or 8 miles with only that many men, 60,000 men perhaps, or whatever he has. Then maybe if he will throw a few probes, he may be able to assault in force and poke 2 or 3 holes and get Johnston on the run. The Battle of Kennesaw Mountain is not Sherman blowing the whistle and sending all of the men over, all 90 or 100,000 go charging across this field to get slaughtered like World War One. That's not his plan. His plan is to tell the Army of the Tennessee, get a division or two to make a strategic strike in this portion of the line, see if we can break open, break the Confederate line. If we can, we'll support it with other troops following. Same thing with the Army of the Cumberland, 4th and 14th Corps. So these are strategic strikes that he's directing, and he's not directing them on top of the big. When you go to Kennesaw Mountain, you see this impressive tall thing. That's Big Kennesaw. He's not attacking Big Kennesaw. He's not even attacking Little Kennesaw. He's attacking the gaps between these, or the areas. There's one called an area where the Burnt Hickory Road is that he's trying to send Logan's 15th Corps into. Then further down at a place called the Dead Angle. But that is a watercolor showing essentially Blackjack Logan's 15th Corps strike. I think there's Sherman himself, sort of at the center of the thing, with an attack. He's behind the 4th Corps area. So this is where we're going to see, 14th Corps. This is where we see Dan McCook's guys, McCook's brigade, Colonel Daniel McCook, one of the fighting McCooks. And he's to thank or to blame for why we have a battlefield today. Get into that story, but the Dan Cook Society put a marker there to memorialize his falling there. He was mortally wounded there at the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, and we'll have his picture in a minute. But that is the Dan Cook Society, and their monument sort of was the impetus in getting some 60 acres that was purchased, and that led to one thing led to another, so to speak, and Kennesaw Mountain became a battlefield park. The next one is a watercolor, a Rick Reeves painting showing the Dead Angle, which is Benjamin Cheatham's Tennessee Division and the Federals. That actually depicts the Federals, when they attacked at Kennesaw, they actually overran some of the Confederate skirmishers. Most of the Confederate casualties did not come from their main line. Most of them came from skirmishers being overrun so fast that they didn't have time to get out, and they either kept fighting and firing in their little world, their little war, and they didn't see what was going on around them. And so both flanks got it. Got the guys are running from both sides, but they're still fighting, and they get surrounded and captured. Some of these were some Georgians that were actually up at the prior slide, but this is a good depiction of what happened to some of them. But some of the Georgians of Mercer's Georgia Brigade, many of whom, or Jackson's Brigade, they had been down at Savannah guarding river, or guarding coastal seaport of Savannah most of the war, and had not seen much of the elephant. Resaca was their first elephant, or Dalton. And so some of these were pretty raw troops that were getting overrun there. But by the end of the day, Sherman's going to lose about 2,700 to 3,000 men on the fighting at Kennesaw Mountain. There are men dying and being shot during this siege at Kennesaw. It's about a week before that, or 9-10 days throughout June 16 to June 27, that they're kind of locked in the zone of fire from each other, and they're fighting, so they're casualties every day. But that particular day, the actual Battle of Kennesaw is the 27th of June. We skipped over Culp Farm, Lynn. I'm sorry you asked about that. Johnston sent Hood to the left to try to block the westward. Johnston feared another flanking movement, so he sent Hood to the left down to Culp Farm. There's the crossroads just to the west of that he was trying to get to. And he didn't make it. The Yankees got there first with the most, as Forrest would say. But anyway, the Schofield and the 23rd Corps got there, as well as primarily Williams' division, but Hooker's 20th Corps got there and received the blunt of Hood's attack, mainly by Stewart's division, supported by Stevenson's division. Again, another 1,600 casualties by the attackers to 500-600 casualties by the defenders. That's Cold Farm. You get to Kennesaw Mountain, June 27. There's essentially 3 of these attacks, and there's 2,700, 3,000 federal casualties on that day to roughly 600 Confederates. Again, a lopsided victory for the South. That is where we're going to end it at the end of Tour 4. Yeah, there's Harker, General Charles Garrison Harker, and from Ohio, and he is he's going to be killed at Kennesaw. And he wrote, prior to the battle, he wrote a letter that he thought that this was a forlorn hope. They knew that the attack was coming. They were making preparations. Many of these guys, he actually had a premonition that he would not make it that day, and he was right. The next picture is a picture of Colonel Daniel McCook, who was not killed that day. He was mortally wounded. They would carry him back to Ohio. He was the colonel of the 52nd Ohio previously. Famous also for the only female recipient of the Medal of Honor, Dr. Mary Edwards Walker, was attached to the 52nd Ohio. But he would be carried back, and he would die back in Ohio a couple of weeks later. To folks that think there wasn't much bloodshed in Georgia, this is a picture of the federal cemetery at the Marietta National Cemetery. All of the Federals that were fatal fatalities south of the Etowah River, from basically the Alatoona Pass, Hell Hole, and south, all of these battles, Kennesaw and the ones we've talked about tonight, as well as all of the Atlanta battles, they're going to be interred here after the war. All of the casualties north of the Etowah River, Resaca, Dalton, are going to be buried in Chattanooga, along with the other casualties from Chickamauga and Chattanooga. So just a little bit about what we're going to look at in November 3rd through the 7th.
It is a stunning reflection that sadly we overlook. As I said at the beginning, the Atlanta campaign certainly doesn't get the attention or the respect that it deserves. And when you look out over the Marietta and the Chattanooga cemeteries and realize we're just looking at the Union blood that was shed in this campaign, it hardly seems fair that Atlanta has gotten so little respect. But I think the manner of breaking this program into its component parts, as we're doing, is going to give people a real good look at all of this. And I'm certainly looking forward to this next part with you, Bob. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to chat with me tonight. And for those of you all who tuned in for us, Bob just sent me the breakdown of what he's going to be doing over those couple of days. So I'll get the registration forms up online here pretty directly, and we'd love to see you in November. So with that, Karen, thank you very much. And folks, thanks for joining us. And Bob, you as well. I wish you all a good night.
Thank you all very much.